People often say that sewing or knitting our own clothing is better for the planet. It's more sustainable, it avoids fast fashion, it reduces waste. But is that actually true? Today, I want to take a look at whether making our own clothes is actually sustainable or if it's just a feel-good myth that in practice doesn't really hold up. The first argument is that if we make our own clothing, we're stepping away from fast fashion. No mass production, no sweatshops, no $5 t-shirts that end up in landfill, no questionable workplace environments. If we're doing the work, the idea is that we're stepping away from all of that. Also, when we're making our own clothing, we tend to use nicer fabric or yarn, and we put so much time into the process, which should mean that the garments we produce are going to last longer than something that is mass-produced. And then there's repair. Many of us are more likely to alter, repair, maintain clothing that we have made by hand. But here's the tricky part. Handmade fashion isn't automatically sustainable. Every project creates scrap fabric, bits of yarn that are left over. Sometimes whole projects just don't work out, and there's waste inevitably in that too. And then, of course, for many of us, there is the issue of having a stash of fabric, a stash of yarn, whatever materials you are using to create your handmade wardrobe. It can be easy to acquire more fabric or yarn than you actually need or that you will actually be able to use, and that's not particularly sustainable either, right? Also, even if we are choosing to sew or knit with natural fibers, things like cotton, linen, wool, and we're avoiding synthetics, which I think a lot of us try to do, many of those fabrics and yarns are still mass-produced. And they still take water, energy, and shipping to get to us. Just because we are purchasing smaller quantities, there's still that footprint to consider. So does that mean that making your own clothing is pointless from a sustainability perspective? Not at all. The biggest impact comes when we actually wear what we make for a long time. If you sew a garment that stays in your wardrobe for 5-10 years and gets worn and gets mended and maintained, that's incredibly sustainable. If you are able to knit a sweater that lasts winter after winter and is something that can be mended if needed, that's incredibly sustainable. Also, when it comes to materials, I think the most sustainable thing you can do is to use what you already have. So if you are someone who knits, try to work through all of the yarn in your stash before buying some more. Or with sewing, you probably have a large amount of fabric stashed away that you purchased because you wanted to make something with it. Try to revisit that stash before you go out and bring in more materials. Also, with sewing in particular, you can source fabrics from a lot of different places that are not just going and purchasing freshly made fabric off of a bolt, right? We do have the ability to get secondhand fabrics and to repurpose fabric from other places as well. Another great tip, if you're a knitter, is to consider unraveling a sweater. So this could be a thrifted sweater that's 100% wool and you love the color but not the style or fit of the sweater. You can unravel it and wash it and reuse the yarn. I recently did this for the first time with one of my hand knit sweaters, and it was incredibly rewarding to reuse material from something that just wasn't getting used. So I know it's exciting and fun to go out and buy new fabric and to buy new yarn, and I am definitely guilty of doing that probably more often than I need to. So if you're truly trying to make your creative practice a sustainable one, I think the first thing that you can do is to use the materials that you already have. And finally, handmade clothing can help us step out of the trend cycle. It's so easy to get caught up in purchasing new trends or quickly sewing new trends that you see others wearing. It can be fun to do that from time to time. And if you're using stash or thrifted materials, great, but the simple fact that sewing or knitting your own clothing takes so long helps us to slow down and to have a better perspective on the trend cycle. And if we're focused on being really intentional about our choices, trying to make pieces that will last long term for many years, we are less likely to participate in the trend cycle, which ultimately is more sustainable because trends come and go. And if we purchase materials to make the trendy item, as opposed to just purchasing the trendier item, we're still purchasing new materials, right? So inevitably, making things by hand takes longer. Hopefully that will help us to have a broader perspective on what is worth our time and money investment. And hopefully that will help us to have a little bit more wisdom when it comes to whether or not we're participating in the trend cycle, which ultimately leads to a more sustainable creative practice. Obviously, there are also lots of scrap busting projects, and if you guys would like to see a video where I highlight what to do with and how you can make use of both your sewing and knitting scraps, do let me know in the comments below. Also, I would love to hear from you guys. Is being sustainable in your sewing and knitting hobby important to you, or is it something that isn't top of mind? Because as I said, inevitably sewing and knitting your own garments take so much longer, and the act of doing that alone is stepping outside of the fast fashion consumer cycle. I think choosing to create your own clothing in general is a huge accomplishment and something that you should be proud of and excited about, and it does help you step away from the cycle of consumerism. I also think that it makes you a more intelligent consumer because it teaches you about the quality of the sewn or knit garment. Once you've made a few yourself, you can much more easily recognize when something is poorly made, and hopefully that will help you to make more sustainable choices when it comes to purchasing ready-to-wear items as well. I know that when I started to make the majority of my clothing, I felt like a light bulb had gone off, and when I would go into a store, all of a sudden I had a much more critical eye of garments than I did before. And that can be incredibly helpful when shopping ready to wear, but it can also be super valuable when you're thrifting and finding vintage and secondhand items too. So I think that sewing and knitting can be sustainable practices. I think intentionality is very important. And I think that being mindful of how much, as far as materials we are consuming and how much we're making, and how long we're wearing the items that we make, all of this has a lot to do with how sustainable our practice is. So let me know in the comments if you have any other input. I would love to hear your feedback. If you have any tips or tricks that make your practice more sustainable. If you're new here, my name's Rebecca. I love making videos about sewing and knitting a handmade wardrobe. So if that's something that is of interest to you as well, please consider subscribing. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this was an interesting conversation. I hope that we can continue the conversation in the comments, and I look forward to chatting with you in the next one very soon. Bye.